Well, hello everybody, and thank you for coming this afternoon. We'd like to welcome you. One of the very first informational meetings we were sponsoring West Fargo, Moorhead, and Cass County for just informational and education. There's a lot of things going on with Vector, and it's important that we get in front of our residents and our folks to explain what we're doing, give more insight on how the process works, and what we can do better and move forward from there. So we have Ben Prather with us this afternoon from Cass County Vector Control. He's stepped forward and is willing to give the full presentation. He is the smartest gentleman I know that works in the data collection and everything that goes with the vector control program. We will go through his presentation, and at that point that he finishes up, we will have some time for questions, answers, people to speak. So if you would like to speak, please step up to the mic over here on my left side. It would be your right, and we'll take any comment and feedback that you may have. Ben, I will welcome you to the podium here and let you take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Dow. Again, my name is Ben Prather. I'm the director of Cass County Vector Control. I started there in 2009 as the director and had numbers of years of experience doing mosquito control, both as a seasonal employee and also in the Twin Cities metropolitan area full-time. But I've been the director since 2009 and have been through a number of different scenarios. So just to start off today, we're going to run through some, primarily informational things, maybe a little bit of standard information about mosquito control practices and what specifically Cass County does to address both nuisance level mosquitoes and, of course, the disease carrying or vector species. So, the primary misconception I think we see out there is that folks kind of just expect that we're only looking at controlling adult mosquitoes, that we're only out with truck-mounted sprayers or aircraft or, actively going to apply insecticide to knock out those adult populations after they've hatched. And that's actually one of the smaller aspects of the program, maybe number two in the total scheme of things. And we'll demonstrate here in a couple different slides and some different metrics, looking at the different proportion of work that we've done, both through a number of man hours, labor hours, but also in respect to some of the products that were consumed just in this last season. So good integrated pest management or integrated mosquito management really has four main parts that we list here on the left-hand side. Public education, of course, is always, your dump and drain and wear a DEET-containing repellent and, make sure you're avoiding dusk and dawn if at all possible, but also informational meetings, press opportunities, our online meetings and our digital assets when we're putting out press releases and some of those things. Source reduction is a little bit smaller of the tools that we at Cass County use, but certainly our folks at the City of Fargo, City of Moorhead, City of West Fargo with your stormwater retention projects and so forth are deeply involved with. Without stormwater infrastructure, specifically, this program would be nowhere where it's at right now. And approximately 20% of our total annual effort primarily goes towards the control of those larval or aquatic mosquitoes that you see us treating in right-of-way along ditches and some of those things. And looking at just our payroll costs for Cass County Vector Control, you can see that in the 2020 season, over $250,000 in labor hours and associated costs, 75% was pushed into our larval control efforts, and only $54,000 for the actual adult control side of the operation. This does not include aerial applications. This is purely metrics from Cass County's payroll. We do a big number of larval site inspections. Specifically, last year we had 43,000 and change actual inspections of standing water and other habitat. And that actually yielded just under 10,000 physical applications or placing pesticide down in there. So when we say larval control, we're doing an abundance of surveillance there too. We're not applying insecticides unless it's absolutely necessary for us to do that. Another way to kind of look at this, of course, outside of the payroll metric in terms of the hours spent, is to look at total amount of pesticide that actually is going into the environment and what kind of mode of action, so to speak, is being utilized. And in 2020, over 60% of the total products that were placed in Cass County, the city of Moorhead, and our partnering agencies here, government agencies, was done with larval control active ingredients. The real actual poundage, of course, is quite a bit higher. Most of the products are anywhere from 2 to 6% of active ingredient by mass. And same with some of the adult control products, the aerial applications, and the adulticides that come out of the trucks are specifically, diluted down. But to compare those measures, we felt it was important to, show that a bulk of active ingredient that's applied to the effort of mosquito control is specifically set for larval control. That is our number one obligation. That's the first thing we do in April, and it's pretty much primarily one of the last things we do in September once the season finally winds down. On the right just is just kind of a depiction of what our overall territory, jurisdictional area that we occupy. And really what I'm doing there is trying to illustrate that we are Cass County Vector Control. We do participate in control activities, again, with our partnering, neighboring, sister agencies, even across the river here. But there is a vast area that actually falls under our jurisdiction that has essentially no mosquito control activity that's performed in there. And that is, twofold. Obviously, economics is important. Population, if there's not many human beings there, we're not really, that terribly interested in just a square section of corn, but we're really focusing on the human population. But the other way to look at this is to show that outside of pretty much any municipal city limits, it's very rare that we're doing really any type of application. And a predominant number of our larval control applications and a significant amount of our adult control and, of course, aerial are done primarily in the metropolitan area and surrounding bedroom communities. So lots of other places where there are habitats that are untouched, that are not controlled for mosquitoes, that have natural, forested areas, natural prairie areas that we won't enter, and we have no objective reason to ever go out and do any control in those areas. A smaller tranche here of what actually occurs out in those rural areas. Primarily, when you're looking at larval control programs, you're talking lots of equipment, you're talking lots of payroll, you're talking significant investment into those areas. And the areas outside of the core metropolitan area and outside of our rural cities, typically we're looking at anywhere from $30,000 to $40,000 of total tax funding that we are receiving in those areas. So primarily in those cities, we are doing adult control applications. City of Kindred specifically, I did a presentation a few years ago now that was looking at the potential for larval control possibility in and around those city limits. And the cost that our estimate was somewhere between $15,000 to $20,000 per year to be able to provide larval control services for the city of Kindred in and around 1 mile outside of their territorial jurisdictions, with no guarantees that that would be the end-all be-all of their mosquito population. So definitely there's quite a bit of cost associated specifically with the larval control program. Again, just a good illustration looking at that payroll cost. It's pretty easy to break out. Within our metro area, if you'll excuse the term, we're over 90% of our total efforts, again, are in the metro and dedicated for larval control. So these are some interesting slides, and this really kind of is the challenge to the question, well, maybe we need to larvicide more. And outside of the economics of finding the cash to be able to do that, there certainly are significant risks and challenges. Of course, living in a floodplain, we've all seen the river flood, we've seen miles of fields that are flooded in early spring. That's really not as big of an issue in the summertime. But every ditch mile in Cass County is abundantly filled with mosquitoes pretty much from end to end. So the only way really to actively get out and do larval control assessments and actual applications is really to get a four-wheeler out there and get on site and do those applications. The folks at the city of Moorhead specifically were looking to see if there was any opportunity to reach out further into Clay County and do some larval control. And that's something that we do constantly. We're looking for expansion of that larval control terrain or area, if you will. But that's not without risk. So these are just a collection of pictures of some of the risks and challenges that we have seen with our staff. Fortunately, we've been exceedingly lucky that we've never had any major injury or fatality or anything of that nature. But quite frankly, there really is no way to try and approach these sites without some sort of mechanized device. Quite frankly, the unmanned aerial systems are just not quite ready for these types of tasks yet. But that's a possibility. But in all of these scenarios, our staff were out checking and inspecting either dry sites that maybe had no water, or as you can see in the middle there, sites that were up over your knee in terms of water height and had challenges with. And we fortunately saved all of these machines, but they were a little worse for the wear. Additionally, outside of our all-terrain vehicle fleet, which we have over a dozen right now to cover the 200 approximately square miles of larval control, primarily ditches and things, we have a large fleet of other types of equipment, specifically pickup trucks with sprayers and a handful of other those elements that absolutely necessary to go out and apply insecticides. You can't really carry insecticides inside of a closed passenger vehicle, and of course, we're not asking our employees to drive their personal vehicles, but there's extensive cost when you're talking about having an effective larval control area, and that you need to fill people and you need to have equipment in those places. And of course, most of us know that that comes with some risk, and it's not every year we get into these kinds of incidences, but the one on the top left is one of the more recent challenges where we had a vector control vehicle cause a 4-car pileup. So not without its own risks. And then the one on the top right, one of our staff members was filling out his paperwork for the morning right at maybe 6:30 in North Moorhead. And somehow a dump truck drove around him and then backed up and drove up onto his hood, all within that time. So that ended up being his last day. He was already scheduled to leave, but he moved on to his master's in public health program after that note. So not exactly a good experience there, but definitely some associated risks, damage to infrastructure, and so on. So kind of looking back again at the overall kind of outlay of services in our service area to better visually represent outside of the map that we had back here, we're going to jump ahead to looking at that in maybe a more digestible type scenario. So looking at the total rural townships where, again, we're not applying larvicide, we're not applying adult control products, we're not really able to do surveillance because the cost is quite extreme given the resources that are required. 76% of that total terrain that we are in charge of has absolutely no action taken. So in integrated mosquito management, there's always the option for no action. And that is something that is utilized more often than not based on, again, economies of scale, population, and funding. A number of reasons just does not permit us to go out and hit those areas with any type of control. And then obviously a relatively large area of urban or metro suburban type scenarios, and then a lesser degree of just the rural jurisdictions, your Leonards, your Arthurs, so on and so forth. So this is kind of the same idea, but we're looking more at a collection of dates and times. So really what I'm trying to do with this particular graphic is just illustrate the season that was 2020. So I think everybody thinks back and can remember the aerial applications and the truck fogging applications. And we certainly do. Those are definitely, long, very challenging nights that take quite often, days of anticipation and preparation. But realistically, the overall number of applications versus the total summer evenings that we have outlined here is rather small. Some of you who maybe have lived here in the past have seen applications in a season that exceed 15 to 18, maybe 20 truck-mounted sprays, add in some aerial sprays. But overall, a bulk majority of our season, which is the typical high summer season, when you're seeing temperatures in excess of 60 degrees, a bulk of those nights really see no adult pesticide applications, adult mosquito control applications. So looking at a kind of a little different view of what we're talking about, this is a bit of a confusing slide, so I have a few of these, so just bear with me. But what we did here was take a look at calendar year 2020. And we, of course, did ground and aerial applications in those years as we have in the past years. So going back to 2015, I wanted to show the types, the evenings that we sprayed across the spectrum of these 6 seasons that we outlined. Now, the big challenge is that the 23rd is not, sometimes lands on a Sunday or something like that in July, but we scaled the previous years to day of the year. So the 22nd of July was the 168th day of the year or something like that in 2020. So we grabbed the 168th day of the year for those past 6 seasons and compared. But really what this does illustrate is 2 things. One is July is crazy busy. And 2, there's really no rhyme or reason, and that's easily explained. And we'll get into that here maybe just in a second. But there's no pattern. There's not very many occurrences that happened on the same day of the year. Very rarely is in this time period did we complete 2 applications just based on well, it's Monday, we should go out and spray. And we'll get into the details of why we do that here in a minute. The second part that I want to illustrate is that as the seasons start moving forward, and of course we start tipping more into fall, it's very common for us to see a traditional dry kind of August. And what this illustrates here is that as we move later and later into the season, those applications between July and August are far more sporadic. Total number of evening adulticide applications really come down and really kind of hit the bare minimum, that week of 8/17 through, approximately the 25th of August, or you can go all the way back to 8/12 in this 6-year interval. And the big reason why I should say this occurs is that we are primarily or specifically only doing these adult control applications based upon the scientific evidence and merits of what our trap collections dictate. We're not making these decisions based upon emotional preferences or complaints or anything like that. We have very strict quality control, or specifications maybe is a better term to use, for our adult control applications. And we have a very, I would say, very tight threshold that we need to exceed in order to order or send out any of these control units, be that ground or aerial. And in August, as it dries out, there just isn't the need. We don't see the numbers that are typical in July, where we'll have most of our traps exceeding threshold, or all of them in August. It's kind of those late season thunderstorms that kind of dictate what kind of season we're going to have during that period. But also we have to consider the high likelihood of West Nile virus transmission in our region typically occurs in that late July into and through August, where we see high temperatures. Some drying conditions really are conducive for the specific mosquito Culex tarsalis to really propagate and cause problems for both us and of course the population that does fall ill with that. One point I also like to discuss using these graphics is you'll note that in the other slides, you see kind of a bigger, more variety between aerial and ground. And the primary reason that we're switching to maybe a more aerial focus, you could say, is that anytime after, in this particular year on August 17th, we start losing our staff. So a bulk of our employees that are able to man those vehicles, we have 32 ground units for truck-mounted spraying operations that typically take somewhere between 4 to 5 hours per evening for us to go out and complete one full round in our metropolitan area, not even thinking about any of the rural cities. We typically drop to, less than 10 or 15 staff members anytime after that second week of August. It's very rare that we have, in fact, more than a dozen people, full-time staff included, which there are only 4 of us. So in the best of times in July, we're out making applications in Fargo, Moorhead, West Fargo, and so forth. That can take us in our very quickest time frame, anywhere from 4.5 to 4.25 hours when we have skilled employees, staff who have already done this at least one other time and are familiar and comfortable in making these applications. That well dries up. And as we move and push further into August and September, students are back in class. It is a seasonal job. They have other obligations to attend to. And quite frankly, at times, the aerial application is really the only tool that's left in the box. So again, kind of scaling this back to a statistical kind of model rather than over a calendar model, looking at the past 6 years, that same interval that we looked on the calendar, looking back through that history and saying, okay, of all the days in the summer months, June 15th through September 15th, which is our primary adult control season, there were 503 days over those 6 years that we did absolutely no adult control applications, meaning our trap counts, our trap data was not indicating either disease-carrying mosquitoes or potential for disease-carrying mosquitoes, or we did not have sufficient threshold numbers for nuisance. So this mirrors very closely. 2020, last season, falls very squarely in line with what our expectations were in the previous 6 years. And had we gone back further, we could have probably painted a similar image. And quite frankly, the last 3 or 4 seasons have been significantly more challenging, meaning we've had worse conditions for mosquitoes than we had than, say, 2009 or 2012. So those years are outliers where we maybe only spray once or twice a season. And this is kind of a little bit of a heavier data point, given that we did have rainy conditions over the last few seasons at the least. I think this is important to note. Our pilot and I have spoke at length with this, and of course with both industry representatives and of course the chemical manufacturers. And something that we are intimately involved with is the chemistry of the products and the types of materials that are actually going out into the environment. And I think the big challenge recently was people see the aerial spray as something that's unique or different, or there is some sort of issue, or something is being performed in a different way, so it must not be the same products. And that certainly just is not true. The type of products that come out of our truck-mounted sprayers are exactly the same active ingredient and the same mode of action as what we see out of our aerial spray program. So to try and put that to rest, that fundamentally at its base chemistry, there realistically is nothing different. And our pilots in the audience here today, and the analogy he got from a doctor's friends of his was, if you're ordering your Amazon package, you don't care if it comes on a truck or if it has ever flown on an airplane, you still get that package delivered. You don't typically, tell whoever, Amazon or whomever, that, well, I don't want this on an airplane, or I don't want this on a pickup truck. The fact remains is that the product delivered at the end of the day, same active ingredient, on the same mode of action and the same effects. So kind of looking again into a historical perspective, we went through our notes going back at least to 2015 and as well as this year. I have a representative from Airborne Custom here, and we can get more into depth with this here in a minute if there's questions. But during that same interval between 8:15 and 9:15, which is kind of the elephant in the room when it comes to Monarch Migration, there were 32 aerial applications conducted for cities during that interval. Just one of those occurred here in Cass and Clay counties. Just in the week of August 25th through the 31st, there were 14 aerial applications that were performed by our partner agency, our contractor, Airborne Custom Spraying. Historically, going back, spraying during that final week of August into early September has been a frequent occurrence. Of course, we have everything from 2020 back to 2015, but we sprayed on 8/31 of 2016. A little later in 2014. 2010, we had a split night operation where we only had one aircraft on station, and it took more than one try to get out and cover all that area. 2008, 8/29. So during any of those particular events or those applications, we saw zero incidences of any major non-target event during the concurrence of that. And my slides moved a little bit out of order here, but I'm going to get into these, my task groups here in a minute. But one of those objectives kind of down the list is to find if there is any evidence that there was some sort of freak coincidence there. That is something that there has been detailed scientific debate on, and part again of some of the national work groups that have been formed around the North Dakota event. So getting kind of in the weeds here a little bit, but just to explain a little bit about the actual dosage of the products that we're using. We can get into some of the chemistry and things of that, the particulars of it, and why we feel the profile of the products and its toxicities are considered safe by the CDC and the EPA for these types of applications. But for the moment, I just want to consider the dose. When you're in an ag setting or in a mosquito control setting, we scale lots of things to acreage. So we want to take a moment just to define that term. What is 1 acre? And of course, we can see Gate City Field, this is the outdoor stadium. When you're thinking of an acre, just keep in mind an acre basically is the playing field area inside of the end zones on a standard American football field. So that is approximately 1 acre in size. When we're talking about the rate of product that we're applying, remember we mentioned total pounds of product applied across Cass County and Moorhead and so forth. There were some like 2,000 pounds of active ingredients in larval control and a significantly less number for adult control products. When we're talking about adult control applications, the rate there is 0.007 pounds per acre. We're talking something on the order of 3 to 4 grams that are sprayed out over that entire football field, sans the end zones. To approximate that and give you a kind of a basis of what that weight is, we're scaling to essentially a dollar equivalent. So the weight of $3 bills broken up into microscopic particles that are typically fractions of the width of human hair, about the size of a red blood cell, are spread out across that 43,000 square feet approximately. Now, if you were to try and spray that same area, that same turf, that same terrain with a household pesticide or products that are commercially available on the marketplace for homeowners and residences to maybe spray their yards or their vegetation and things like that, the amount of active ingredient that you're using in that type of situation to spray that same amount of area is 2 orders of magnitude greater. So we're looking at 0.34 pounds of active ingredient when your homeowner goes to your local hardware store and picks up this specific Tempo SC is the trade name for cyfluthrin, which is just another common pyrethroid insecticide, just like permethrin. So again, to give you some scale in terms of mass, that 0.34 pounds of active ingredient is it's actually greater than the stack of $151 bills based upon the U.S. Mint's assertion that a dollar bill weighs about a gram. Scaling that down to what, well, let's relate that back to what happens in an individual homeowner's yard. Most people don't often find themselves on the NDSU football fields during these applications, but what is occurring on my property, on my parcel of land? Now, in Fargo specifically, which is where I did this analysis on the overall area of a yard, approximately the average point for the normal size yard in the city of Fargo is just a tad bit over 0.2 acres, or 1/5 of 1 acre. So to scale that same quantity down, when you're looking at 0.007 pounds per acre, scaled across 0.2, it's pretty simple math, but to, again, provide some context, we're talking about just over a quarter of the mass of a penny, of a U.S. penny. And the equivalent of it's about 60%, of course, of what the weight of a $1 bill, again, divided in millions and millions of microscopic drops that are essentially invisible to the naked eye. People think that another good misconception from a different perspective is probably 3 times a year we get complaints that we're spraying the streets and the mosquitoes are in the backyards. What's wrong with you? What are you doing? And quite frankly, the objective is for these particles to not land straight down in the street, but when you're breaking up a stream of oil-based or water-based insecticide to the size of anywhere from 20 to 60 micron in size, again, fractions of the width of a human hair and typically smaller than a red blood cell, those products are going to be carried aloft into the wind and are going to penetrate downwind specifically. So to assert that the product is falling from the nozzle straight on the ground is absolutely not the case. We also have strict parameters on what kind of wind speeds we're dealing with too, but that's maybe another discussion for another day. But when we are applying with our products, it's not necessarily that the truck was, behind me, or it didn't, go in my backyard or whatever, or sometimes we get complaints that, the aircraft didn't fly over my house, but it flew over the next block over. There's definitely some atmospheric effects that we're relying upon to disperse those products. So just because you can't see it or because you think it's diminished off the nozzle does not mean that it's not there. So this is a little wordy slides, and I kind of only got halfway through it, if I'm honest with you, with this. But speaking specifically to our primary adult control products, again, are these pyrethroids, and primarily permethrin as our main active ingredient. These products are used very, very widely. Any typical household ant, wasp, hornet killer that you're going to go and purchase is primarily going to have some derivative of a synthetic pyrethroid. A lot of the raid products are alethrin. So like we mentioned, cyfluthrin and tempo. We use a product called bifenthrin in some of our backpack sprayers. But the only real active ingredient that we're using in mass for our adult control is this permethrin. And this is a very wide history, and you'll have to excuse me that the font is a little small. I was expecting to be able to fill up a little bit more information on here, but I did hit a few, very, I think, articulate points to the profile of the product and where it's used and how. And I think the most biggest take-home message here is that not only is permethrin registered by the EPA for insecticidal applications, it's also registered by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration as an approved drug that is used predominantly for the treatment of head lice on children. And you'll see it for other skin infections with parasites, scabies, and some of those things that are actively rubbed onto your skin. They also use our Also use case scenarios per permethrin. The agricultural field is, the number one, hands down, main consumer of pyrethroids and permethrin. Most every conventional crop that is found in your grocery aisle is going to have some derivative, again, of that permethrin found on there. And something that we actually found out pretty recently, that permethrin is actually used to fumigate aircraft upon descent. So depending on which country you're flying to and from, these are mostly international flights, but in order to maintain and control primarily mosquito-borne illnesses, but also agricultural pests and different things like that are disruptive to the ag economy, they are actively fumigating the passenger cabins with people present. Now, that's not every country, but the World Health Organization actually has a document that discusses the risk profile of these things and effectively encourages its utilization. So now we know the what. This kind of gets more into the sad state of affairs in my head during the mosquito control season, when we know that conditions are ready to turn on us and that we need interventions. And this just, in my best effort to articulate, what kind of that workflow looks like, really is the primary just kind of thought train that I bring, not only myself, but my employees and our partnering agencies at Fargo, West Fargo, and Moorhead along for the ride, to kind of try and do my best to forecast out what is going to happen or what our expectations are with any one particular rainfall event. Again, larval mosquitoes require standing water. The bulk majority of ours are what we term floodwater mosquitoes. So those mosquitoes hatch out after heavy rains. They're not typically found in your containers and things like that. We're talking about agricultural drainage. We're talking about river frontage that has overflowed. And again, probably our biggest issue predominantly are roadside ditches. Think of the interstate, think of rural township roads and so forth. Those areas are ideal for these types of mosquitoes. So within that first, call it, 2 to 15 to 20 days after a significant downpour, typically we look at anything over 3/4 of an inch as something that is going to take considerable effort, depending on how widespread it is. That's when we activate that larval control portion of our program and our integrated mosquito management aspects. So those efforts begin pretty much immediately after the rain stops. Typically, we'd like to give it 12 to 24 hours because a lot of times it takes a little bit to be able to actually see the mosquito larvae. Sometimes they're translucent and typically are smaller than about 1/2 millimeter in length. So it can be challenging to actually identify those habitats. So, or those specific instars, or that developmental stage of the immature mosquito. So anytime after that rain event occurs, we're out checking approximately 6,700 on that order, 6,700 sites, much higher. I'm getting a thumbs up. Over 6,000 sites are inspected on essentially a weekly rotation. So we've gone through and have documented, and we can maybe highlight some of this here later in a different, I might need to pull up a web browser or something, but we send our 40+ staff out into the field to not only treat sites for mosquitoes, but we also want to inspect. We're out there looking at the conditions that are there. We're identifying whether there are mosquito larvae or not, because if there's nothing there and we check it once and we check it twice, there's no reason to actually apply any of these products. It's just not effective. And if there are, on day 1 or day 10, of course, we're making those applications and providing those interventions as necessary. During that time, we are continuously doing adult mosquito nuisance surveillance. So again, referencing the vector mosquitoes, those that are capable of transmitting disease, which is quite a few in fact, but nuisance mosquitoes we typically don't associate as much with the potential for transmitting specifically West Nile virus, although it has been documented, even in Cass County, that you can see these nuisance mosquitoes carry and transmit West Nile. But nonetheless, our nuisance surveillance is continuous. We have one of the best, if not the best, nuisance mosquito surveillance programs in North America. I say that with no blushing, and with a high degree of pride that from one day to the next, we have a very good pulse of what is actually happening in the community. But nonetheless, as we're moving forward through this timeline of what our control philosophy is going to be, as we've started engaging and getting an understanding of what that larval surveillance is doing, what kinds of site inspections have we've seen. Have we seen high numbers? Have we seen low numbers? Has the ground dried up substantially? It gives us kind of an idea of what's kind of downhill from us. And that all kind of falls into this adult control operational planning. And with that, we feed in a bunch of variables of, are there staff available to complete these applications? Are they licensed? At the beginning of the year, we have challenges where our employees are not yet fully licensed by the state agricultural departments, which is a requisite for handling and applying insecticides in North Dakota and Minnesota. So that's a big question. Of course, we are beholden to climatic conditions. Not only is it too windy, is it too cold, we're also looking in sequence. If we have a 4-inch rain one day and then 7 days later we have another 2-inch rain, that really kind of garbles up this planning. So we really have to take all of those effects into account to say, when is the best time to deploy control application X? When is it better to maybe shift over and do an aerial, or so on and so forth? So working through those discussions and those challenges, primarily my obligation to try and calculate and look ahead. As we move forward in that planning process, count down to anywhere from 5 to 1 day ahead of what we call, the hatch. And there's some terms I kind of mix up in here, and I'll try and explain it. So technically, the mosquitoes hatch from eggs into larvae, and then they emerge from larvae to pupa to adults. So even I goof that up just in my vernacular, so excuse that. But what we're really looking for is that big pop of adult mosquitoes that we see after any significant rain event. During that time, we start getting a pulse, we evaluate that data, and start working with our municipal partners and others to say, hey, this is going to happen. We expect X, Y, and Z scenarios to work out. Let's either consider aerial or maybe consider just a ground fog, or we'll look at some more of these details later moving on. But we always wait for those applications to initiate once we've hit those thresholds. And we'll talk about our threshold here in some additional slides. But here, the threshold we indicate is a 25 female per night per trap average. And I mentioned our absolutely wonderful nuisance surveillance program. When we say per trap average, that is a collection of, I believe we have 28 within Fargo, West Fargo, and Moorhead, and you add another 3 in the city of Horace. You add in Harwood and a handful of others with and around that area. We're sampling typically over 30 locations on a daily basis to determine what this threshold tally is. And this has been our historical standard going back past 2003. Back when I was as a seasonal employee at Cass County Vector Control, that average actually for initiation of adult control applications was based on a trap average of 100 mosquitoes per night. And I say that with distinction in that during that time, we were not relying our surveillance data to even determine whether there were male or female mosquitoes present in those traps. And that's significant because male mosquitoes do not bite. Female mosquitoes are the ones that require the blood meal, require that protein in its target to be able to actually produce eggs, and then go on and lay its progeny and basically survive. So the distinction of using the female trap average across this network has and will be, kind of our primary, trigger mechanism. But we elaborate a little bit more on that and try and build into that with some novel techniques and some different analysis that we'll talk about here in a minute. So once we've exceeded, or we're at that point where we're no longer expecting to see any larval mosquitoes or any aquatic life cycle stage larvae or pupae that are present in the water. And again, those are done with field observations by our 40 plus staff members. We're expecting that hatch, but we're still sitting and waiting for the adult mosquitoes to emerge and cause, wreak havoc on us. And traditionally, that's anywhere from, 1 to 3 days after mosquitoes have left the standing water sites. And that's something that we can see and monitor as we move along. Once we've hit that metric, it's relatively straightforward. We're evaluating again that baseline measure of what's that average, are we over 35? But also, and I think I have a zoomed in picture, we're attempting to do some population analysis that quite frankly no one else in North America or elsewhere is attempting to do in terms of determining that spatial spread of that mosquito population, and something that has gained interest from not only people in mosquito control, but academia from Notre Dame and parts in Florida and elsewhere. So something that other people are looking at us and saying, wow, that's pretty neat. Once we hit those numbers again, now it's time to initiate those adult control applications or interventions, however you want to put it out there. And during the whole process of discussion and understanding, evaluating the outbreak, understanding whether there's multiple broods or multiple hatches of mosquitoes that are about to occur, that's when we get into essentially kind of your snap count, if you will, pardon the sports pun or expression. But the choice really comes down to, again, what assets are on hand, what's our conditions, what are our expectations, and what things do we need to do to try and bring things back to a better place. And typically that falls into two categories, and sometimes that middle lane of both. The ground ULV treatments, again, same product, same active ingredient, pretty much the identical partnering, mirrored image of its aerial application. Sometimes it's easier to trigger if we're expecting less than ideal conditions. Sometimes we need clearance to be able to, if there's events or things going on. Sometimes it's just faster for us to engage and get those ground sprays going. Sometimes it's a smaller risk, or we're seeing maybe more localized challenges with the nuisance mosquito population that are popping up. So we're targeting some of those things maybe more specifically with trucks, but probably most importantly when we have the resources available, meaning we have bodies to apply the product when necessary. Aerial, we have some different, of course, it's similar parameters in terms of temperature thresholds and what have you, but there definitely are some benefits that we can chat about as we go further down the pipe here. But sometimes ground is a little more messy because it takes more than one application. It might take more than one night to complete the same objectives that you're doing with the aerial application. So before that is even engaged, before that ball's even hiked, we're requesting approvals from just about everybody. During this whole process, I have essentially journaled every possible outcome and tried to forecast as deep as I possibly can into the coming days. And during that process, we get verbal or written signatures or signing off on these types of applications and whether they should occur or whether there's any objections or any cause for alarm. And that has been consistent in my tenure here. We are always chatting with our vector board members and our partnering, sistering agencies here that we want to identify that if there's issues, speak up now. Otherwise, we have plans to move ahead on whatever day. Typically, this is maybe the day before. Sometimes it can be up to a week ahead of time when we know we're going to have a specific event. And when conditions are really rough, we start playing out different scenarios where, say again, we had a 4-inch rainfall on the 1st. We picked up a 2-inch rainfall on the 6th. Now we're dealing not with one unique hatch of mosquitoes, we're dealing with two that are going to be intermingling over the course of that period. So we have to put up a specific kind of chess move scenario that's going to require more than one moving part or one piece. So my initials there are just referencing, overlapping brood conditions, or when we have probably most significant is when that 4-inch rainfall hits, and then 4 or 5 days later, the river comes up out of its banks and floods the basin of Oak Grove and the Lindenwood Parks and elsewhere. Now you have a mosquito or groups of mosquitoes that are almost ready to, reach adulthood and come up and cause problems, followed immediately after a particular another group of mosquitoes that are coming off the flood banks in that flood area that has recently been swamped or overran. And I'm running a little long per usual, but to maybe close things out and maybe we can open up for questions. It's already 20 after 5. These are those metrics that I was talking about, that standardized tool of looking at, okay, what is our average trap count per night, average female trap count per night. You could see we're kind of indicating that here in this line. And quite frankly, this year was rough. We saw more nights over that threshold number. We saw bigger spikes than we had in the preceding 5 or 10 years. So realistically, we had one of the rougher seasons in my 13 or so years in Cass County doing this job. So again, here you can see what that average count is. You can see here these bars, the yellow bars are indicating when those adult control applications have occurred. You can see sometimes I'm really, really on point and we get it really nailed perfectly. Sometimes it's not as good, and we might need to go back and retime an application or repeat something to that degree. But the important thing here is that in the year 2020, we saw a major rainfall event that occurred on the 10th. We picked up somewhere in that 4-inch rain total, specifically in the areas south of Fargo and Moorhead, that knocked down some power lines outside of Oxbow and some of those things. So you might have seen some of that in the news. But during this interval, we had a really good indication of what we were about to experience and what was the key trigger. And as we moved down into the final throes of this particular event, we were continuously monitoring these traps for nuisance conditions, and I rightfully made some predictions that we would likely see some records fall, some recent historical records anyway, and that's what turned out to be true. And this novel technique and this approach of looking at what mosquito populations are doing relationships to themselves, or looking at, okay, a single line is pretty easy to understand. But what we're doing with our modeling in this population geospatial relationship is we're taking these traps, and over the past 11 seasons now, we go back to 2010 and we have digitized all of those databases. They had all traditionally been done in pen and paper, but we've gone in and created, each location has its unique file with it. So every night that we have a trap collection that occurs, it goes into our logs. And what this demonstrates here is taking a specific trap night, in this instance, the night of August 25th into the 26th. So the date that's recorded here is actually the morning when it's collected. So that's a little bit of a twist on it as well. But at any one of these points, we can go back and look at a minimum of 5 years of historical data. If we really wanted to, we could go much further. We have trap records from Oak Grove and North Fargo that date back to 1958 or 1959. So if we wanted to go back that far, we could. Obviously, that's a huge amount of work and maybe not so relevant. So we basically picked 2010 and forward because we knew we had where our lab capabilities were at, and we chose that as our starting point. So what happens on those particular occasions, or on this particular night, you can see this Oak Grove trap had caught 1,190, it looks like 5 female mosquitoes over the course of that evening. Now, going back into those previous records, which is somewhere for that location that we have documented and digitized, is somewhere in the 12 to 1,300 trap night range. This particular night ranked, of all those nights, into the 99.5 percentile, meaning that in 1,000 days, only 5 days would ever have been worse. And some of these other locations, this is our 12th, we call it our 12th Avenue North trap. There was 568 mosquitoes caught over that one trap night. That set a new 10-year high in that location, so it's indicated 1. So that in no time between 2010 to 2020 was there ever a night where there were more mosquitoes, female mosquitoes, recorded in that trap specifically. The big challenge with our standardized surveillance, we use a handful of different tools for disease carrying for just nuisance mosquitoes, is that not all locations on all geography are the same. And in certain instances, you can catch 1,000 mosquitoes on one side of the street. You put that same trap on another side and you get, 500 or something. So you have to normalize against something. And for us, after quite many years of debate and discussion, we thought that if we keep our traps geographically similar, within a couple 100 feet, if possible, in private residences, or Oak Grove is actually within the park district property, we can at least go back and compare that to those historical norms and paint, what I feel is a very vivid picture of conditions. So all-time records in North Fargo, all-time records up here in Harwood. You can see some of these numbers vary a little bit when you get into, we only saw 77 mosquitoes down here, and I can't recall what we call that trap. It's in the President's Streets. There's a bunch of Adams Street, actually, down in this neighborhood. 77 females was a significant collection for that location. You'll recall there's not a ton of water, not a ton of river frontage, or quite frankly any trees for that matter in that location. So 77 female mosquitoes in the course of the night was horrific for those folks. Whereas, you get over into Concordia, which we do have less data on. We only have about 6 years of data, but that's still 500 or 600 trap nights. We saw 347 mosquitoes, which only ranked to the 97th percentile. So, given in a one season kind of scenario, this would be, maybe the second or third highest worst night of the season in that location. You drop down into South Moorhead or elsewhere, you're seeing, yes, less female mosquitoes specifically, but how that trap performs, you're seeing, over 99% compared to any other previous nights dating back to 2015 on the Moorhead side. So pick a number or pick a trap in there. That's what we're trying to demonstrate. We push this through some software, some of our mapping, spatial analytics, and really what we're doing is basically raising up everything that's in a similar category. And those rank from the the new records to the 95th percentile, 94.9 percentile to the 90th. We go, I think, the 89.9 percentile to the 80th, and then anything underneath that, we start getting into normal shades of, more gray, green, and just kind of what we consider the median. So half the nights are better, half the nights are worse, and anytime we're under that 50 percentile, typically things are pretty peachy. I'm going to stop there. I've been pretty much one whole hour, and there's a handful of folks in the audience. There's not many, but I certainly am welcome. I know there are some questions specifically that have been emailed, and I guess I would like the opportunity to hear those explicitly if there's challenges there.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. Appreciate all the details and the depth that you go into to do your job, and we appreciate that. So if anybody would like, you can step up to the podium and raise any questions, or have Ben or our Airborne Custom Spraying is here as well to discuss anything that might come up or anybody has any questions on. So I actually do have 3 folks, 2 from Moorhead and 1 from Fargo residents, that have sent me emails that I will read the emails and look for some feedback from our professionals here. But if anybody else wants to get up first, I'm open to that. And if not, I will step forward first. It looks like I'm up, so I will move over to that. So I will start with one from Miss Sandra Halverson. First off, she starts off saying, thank you for having this informational meeting. But she has a few comments and questions. In checking with Minnesota cities like Brainerd, Bemidji, Alexandria, Detroit Lakes, Duluth, Fergus Falls, and the Metropolitan Mosquito Control District, she found that some cities do not spray at all, and some spray just areas like parks or for special events or other specific occasions. The Minnesota Control District uses larvicide in standing water, which, if my understanding is correct, it's generally not harmful to most other insect larvae. However, the spray can be harmful to other insects like moths and bees and butterflies. Can you tell us what other insects are killed by spraying?
Well, spraying is kind of a loaded term. As you might gather, I can write a novel just on that word. But when we talk about spraying, we're talking about two things, primarily the larval control applications, and I think specifically the question is coming in more on the adult control side of that product. And to answer that question, that it is absolutely understood and known that adult control mosquito pesticides, even though they're fractions of the dosages that are applied in agricultural settings or even on an individual basis of a homeowner, that we are, I'm trying to phrase this right, that the types of products that we're using are generally the safest in terms of toxicity profile for vertebrates, for mammals, for cats, dogs, people, so on and so forth. But we do understand there is a risk profile when it comes to, again, invertebrates. We're talking, non-target organisms in the environment that might come in contact with these sprays. But based upon, again, the tight parameters and the legal obligations that we have to follow for the calibration and the droplet size and the flow rates of these products, even with those qualifications that are meant to designed to limit the amount of non-target effects, certainly we know that there's going to be some. Clearly that is something that is demonstrated in the environment. So when it comes to any non-target issues, it's something that we take seriously, and that's why our adult control philosophy and those applications have a very high standard of proof that is requisite before we do those types of applications. And I think the other thing that's important to note as well is that she mentioned spraying as kind of a blanket terminology. And of course, larviciding is, again, 80% or better of our total effort and output in any given season. And that was illustrated very well in 2020. But there are also non-target effects when it comes to larval control products. Typically, when we're talking with our primary insecticide and the ones that are used specifically in the Twin Cities area, I did work there for 3 years and did work very intimately with their aerial larviciding applications. They're using a type of a bacterial a pesticide that we actually use here as our primary active ingredient. Those active ingredients can also harm non-targets, typically midges, other types of flies, gnats, and some of those, but generally those are considered pests. But it's important to know that even when you're looking at larval control, depending on the active ingredient, that bacterial insecticide still has non-target effects. So there are issues there. And to the point of the aerial applications and the ground fogging applications, is we're talking about the spectra of the upper Midwest. You can't necessarily compare what happens in Brainerd or Duluth or St. Cloud to what we're seeing in the Red River Valleys. We're seeing different soil types, different soil compositions. They're not dealing with agricultural settings and things like that where we have all these roadside ditches. They have, quite frankly, a lot of more natural wetlands and things that are actually less conducive to producing mosquitoes than you might think. So when there are natural predators in those ponds and pools, typically things balance themselves out a little bit, maybe more, to an equilibrium that's beneficial for less mosquitoes. But to compare us to those particular cities and some of those areas, I would challenge that it's not necessarily that they don't do it, it's just that they can't afford it or they're dealing with problems. I know I've spoke with city council members from Fergus Falls who were just calling me to say, hey, we need something, can you just come and talk to us and see what we can do to try and control mosquitoes, because this is just crazy out here. And in looking at what their wetland habitats around them, the price tag was too much for larval control, was too much for adult control. So quite frankly, they are still in that no action type of situation. And I think a bulk majority of the folks in our community, our taxpayers, expect at least some relief from mosquitoes. And again, integrated mosquito management specifies that we're targeting aquatic life cycle stage and the adult stage when we're talking control applications.
Okay. Sandra then goes on and says, also in North Dakota, Bismarck does some spraying of public areas, but it isn't, my understanding, it's not the entire city. I believe that in Grand Forks, they spray only after legal sunset. They also monitor Monarch Migration sites online. After seeing what pesticides were being used at Cass County Vector Control, I read the labels for these products and most say that it should not be sprayed on waterways and have some setback buffer zones. So wondering if when spraying, Cass County Vector Control avoids the river corridor.
No. The river corridor, again, is a major floodway when it comes to the production of mosquitoes. We're dealing with floodwater mosquitoes. We're dealing with high impact areas that mosquitoes are hatching and emerging right then and there. The actual, challenges when it comes to the, the river corridor, the things that we got to, keep in mind is the product that we're applying, again, the dosage is specified and it's such a small amount and it's such a small particle. Really, deposition isn't the end goal. This product isn't the same as Tempo. Tempo, you're spraying what is called a residual product where you're setting up essentially a barrier or anything that comes in contact with it. When we're dealing with adult control applications, those microscopic droplets are meant to impinge or actually make direct contact with those flying mosquitoes. So it does require them to actually touch it in the air. So we're really deposition when it comes to water bodies and things like that. Definitely are something that people in the industry are always concerned about. But we have protocols, and there are definitely just the overall process of the application really mitigates any of those effects, and the labels do specify as necessary for waterways and so on and so forth. And in reference to the city of Bismarck and some of those other particular issues, is that the city of Bismarck is again, it's a funding source issue. It's not that they don't want mosquito control, it's just that they don't have the budget. Cass County, we have about 2021, we were budgeted for $1.3 million before you add any sort of aerial spray expense. The last time I talked to Mr. Anton Sadler from the Burley Bismarck Public Health Unit, who is the managing employee for their mosquito control district, I don't believe they had even broke over 200,000. I would doubt even over six figures in terms of those. I'm sorry, 80,000 is the most recent tally. So again, it's not necessarily a lack of need, it's a lack of resources to combat that. And to the last point of monitoring the monarch migration, we have been in detailed conversations with, and maybe I'll jump into some of these other slides here to close things out, but we do have been working with a bunch of different partners when it comes, I'm going the wrong way, when it comes to talking specifically with monarchs, one of which, Dr. Chip Taylor, who is the primary director for the monarchwatch.org, has identified essentially that the monarch migration typically starts sometime after August 10th and typically ends sometime before September 20th. Now, we're dealing with a diverse insect with multiple generations across its lifespan. It's not one monarch butterfly that flies up from Texas up to Fargo and then repeats that and goes the other way. We're dealing with sometimes 4, sometimes 5 different generations of insects that are involved during the course of that lifespan. So to be able to say, okay, well, the migration is coming through at this point, at this time, is just really not a feasible, practical, opportunity for us to undertake, because it's really distributed over that and influenced again by weather, and influenced again by the biology of that particular organism. But we are working very closely, again, with some of these folks, some of these advocacy agencies. There's actually a Society for Invertebrate Conservation monarchwatch.org. We've been chatting with, of course, our municipal partners, along with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, which is the primary folks who are in charge of the Endangered Species Act and determining some of those critical habitat issues when you're talking about specifically insects that are critically threatened or endangered. So the ability to rely upon citizen science to say, oh, there's monarchs here, there's monarchs, moving through is a challenge because that is only one slice of time, and we don't have any scientific way, nor does anybody in North America or elsewhere have the expertise or the ability to actively monitor and track those things as we move forward into these scenarios. And again, I think it's important to iterate that we have not only monarchs that are migrating through here, we have monarchs that migrate to here and stop. So we do have a local population. This isn't snow geese or something like that fly straight over us and end up, in the tundra or something like that. These are local, born and bred populations of monarchs that, again, take consideration and detailed planning and things like that when it comes to how we're doing our adult control applications.
Okay, let's move ahead here. Sandra also writes that in the December 30th, 2019 Journal of American Medical Association Internal Medicine Department, the article finds, or it states, in part, high levels of general pyrethroid were associated with higher risk of death from all causes of, risk of death from all causes or cardiovascular disease over a 14-year observation. So she's stating that there's a higher risk.
Yeah, and certainly, anytime you're dealing with substances, the motor oils or gasoline, some of these things, definitely have toxicity profiles. But it's important to note that the high level of study into these molecules, we're talking years of research and development. We're talking about, obviously, tons and tons of oversight when it comes to putting these products to market and their general usage in the general public. We're talking, we mentioned head lice treatments and scabies treatments. Head lice treatments specifically, if you're looking at, a child or, even an adult that has a head lice infestation, the amount of the pyrethroid, the permethrin that's applied to the scalp directly, including to infants, is approximately 1/3 of an acre of what compared to what we do with these aerial applications. So the common thing when you're dealing with chemical risk assessments, it is essentially the how much is there and how much exposure. And our effort is to minimize and mitigate both of that. There's no way I can come in and say every product is 100% safe, but certainly you can drink too much water and cause fatal events. You can drink too much coffee, too much caffeine, and cause a fatal event. But within the parameters of modern society, we have to accept that there are some risk profiles involved in everything, driving cars and so forth. And these products have an exceptional margin of safety that has been documented for decades, and again, continuously studied and questioned. Quite frankly, these types of topics are foremost in that industry, and we follow the science on that and let them lead the way.
And she gets to the end here, and she is wondering if the people of Cass County Vector Control have been able to do the studies that they had mentioned at the Moorhead City Council meeting. She is thinking it was about butterfly and insects' reaction to permethrin in an enclosed environment.
And I will state, for the record, we are not a research institution. We are not North Dakota State University Entomology Lab. We are not any of these organizations or advocacy groups that are out there that have the budget for this, quite frankly. We are a tax-funded organization for the sake of mosquito control under certain guidance. When it comes to following the science or dictating the science, I think we are, in our natural course of our operations, pushing that boundary. And we rely heavily upon the technical experts out in all of these fields. We're working with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who are coming out and saying, what do you guys know about, speaking directly to me and the American Mosquito Control Association on conference calls, asking us what we know about mosquito and monarch biology, and really trying to figure out some of those ins and outs and put those details. So we're hoping that that level of research and focus comes in from some of these partnering agencies and folks who are looking at it. I will mention too that there is no consensus at this point to rule out a freak coincidence. I can't necessarily stand by that. I think there's no real point in even trying to advocate that at this particular incident. But that has been a major topic, specifically between professionals at the American Mosquito Control Association and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to try and rule out that as a bare minimum. Again, we have done these applications during this interval over a number of years. This is the first incident. We do have, other anecdotal situations where folks have either seen monarchs die in relation to, something that occurred when it comes to mosquito control, but more often than not, it's difficult to ascertain that to 100% accuracy. But I think we just more or less move past that debate and allow the science to work its way through.
Okay, I do have two more to go through, but I believe we have someone from the audience. Okay, so I'll read the whole email this time, and then you could answer. So we'll try and move this along a little faster. So this is from Noel Harden. Thank you for hosting this informational events about mosquito vector control in Fargo, Moorhead, and West Fargo. I'm writing as a concerned resident of Moorhead. Like Fargo, we contract with Cowles County Vector Control for mosquito control services. Given the topic, I will note that I have a Master's of Science in Agroecology and over 10 years of professional experience as a public servant working to create a more healthy, resilient, and functional food system. There are three key questions I urge you to consider in any future decisions made around mosquito vector control in the Fargo-Moorhead area. First, does the program work in its current form? Vector Control has identified that they have used the same pesticides for the last 10 years. Therefore, it's probably that mosquitoes are developing resistance to this compound in our local area. In fact, many residents complained after the August 2020 aerial spray, the infamous Monarch massacre, that mosquito bites levels were still exceptionally high. Do you have any data to indicate whether pesticide resistance is any part reasonable for the high mosquito rates witnessed in 2020? Second, what are the consequences of the current program and how can they be mitigated in the future? In addition to monarch butterflies, other pollinators are killed by the pesticide applications practiced by vector control. There are also studies pointing to potential human health effects of pyrethroid pesticides, like those used by vector control, including cancer. Many other cities in Minnesota and around the U.S. have opted to use more targeted mosquito control practices, like larvicide and homeowners education. Vector control in the cities of Fargo, Moorhead, and West Fargo have an obligation to residents to explore those alternative options in good faith. Third, and most important, how can residents of our community have a voice in the decision-making process employed by Vector Control and its board? Pollinators are essential workers when it comes to fruit, vegetables, products. The negative impacts on community-wide pesticides applications have ecological, economic, and social cost to our residents that is unaccountable for in the current decision-making structure. As a resident of Moorhead, I expect my city leaders to take a hard look at our current contract with Vector Control and listen authentically to the feedback from residents during this process. I hope this information session will be the first step in advancing a less harmful approach to mosquito control in our community.
Well, I think the main takeaway, of course, there is we've already discussed at length the efforts that are put forth for larval control applications. 80% of our labor, over $300,000 was dedicated for staff to do larval control practices. 60+% of our total active ingredients applied is in larval control category, and a much smaller portion is dedicated to that adult control application process, and those are as necessary. We require those thresholds to be met, our specific disease metrics to have occurred. We do have a West Nile reduction plan that feeds into that, where thresholds are not really observed when we have people falling ill and requiring some interventions on a purely public health basis. But to the initial point, in terms of monitoring for resistance, now that is a major issue, primarily in the more temperate, warmer, tropical areas of the United States. There you're dealing specifically with mosquito control programs that are seeing mosquitoes that are living as adults continuously and actively biting, for 6, 7, 8 months of the year, 9 months of the year, when you get into, southern Florida, Texas, so on and so forth, you're dealing with species that have longer adult life stages, that have different biology that helps promote that resistance. The specific individual species that we're dealing with, again, are floodwater species. They are called, primarily our main one is called Aedes vexans. We have some Aedes dorsalis, and we have some of these other type of floodwater type mosquitoes that, again, are typically a shorter lifespan, and certainly all of them freeze to death in weather like we saw this past weekend. There was, after about that first heavy frost or that good first freeze, you're wiping out some of those genetics that may potentially have occurred in there. But to date, there is no indication of resistance to any of the insecticides, specifically the adult control products. And quite frankly, the bacterial insecticides that we're utilizing actually have the same mode of action, but it's using 4 different proteins that are discriminately attacking the insect as it is consumed, and is what's causing the mortality. So there's detailed investigational, research and study into all of the above. But for our purposes, we feel that clearly the applications have worked and continue to work. We're not seeing anything that would indicate resistance in any of our applications, and I think that's pretty well illustrated with some of our interventions here. We do have laboratory tools that we're actively trying to engage and monitor when it comes to actually sampling mosquitoes and seeing if there's resistance, but that's a laborious process and something we're engaging in, but very low expectations for there to be any documented level of resistance. I think I got most of them there.
Yep, and I think you covered some of it in your presentation as well, so
Sure.
I think we covered that one. And then we have Rebecca Zarrock Haig, and she lives in southeast Moorhead. She was the first person to sound the alarm about the butterfly massacre. I run a home daycare, and we also raise monarchs, painted ladies, butterflies, and love to feed the bees. We have multiple perennial gardens and 2 large organic gardens in our backyard. We woke up to find dead and dying butterflies that morning. It was gut-wrenching to see them suffering and dying, and it was very obvious they died either mid-flight or right out of the pine trees where they had roosted for the night. I can honestly say after they spray the mosquitoes that day or that evening, they were worse than they had experienced at our house specifically, and also from our house to the park and back. I'm also very sensitive to bites, and so are at least one of my children. So I take measures to protect ourselves from bites. So I understand that there is a need to protect citizens from disease-carrying mosquitoes. However, I'd like to see a better method. My questions are, how can we hold vector control accountable and to make sure this isn't going to happen again? Is the current pesticide effective? I know it was effective against our pollinators, but can we say the mosquitoes were awful after that major spray? How do we get our voices in the process? I felt shut down when I reached out with actual concern immediately by vector control. Our city council indicated in their September meeting they were really interested in pursuing other options and to research what other areas are doing. And she appreciates this opportunity to reach out and voice her concerns.
Sure.
So start at the back,
Yeah.
Some things, accountability, you can maybe touch on, or I can too. So.
Sure, and I did promise a news media thing here in a minute, so I'm going to try and rush, and then I might turn something over to Rob or Mr. Woodley if you have a moment to answer that. But I think that illustrates a very good point of the subjectivity of some people when it comes to how bad conditions were comparatively. We illustrated a very good control application when it came to that 826 spray. It performed as good as we could expect in terms of our trap numbers. Our expectations were, in fact, that we would need a second application. We had discussed that even before we had gotten the first one off. We clearly were knowing in the larval surveillance and just the general rainfall pattern that we had experienced that we were going to see these records and that we were going to need to have not just one intervention, but again, that both category where we're having, such a huge abundance of mosquitoes, or we're having overlaps, or we have all sorts of other aggravating conditions. That is where we do need to do more than one application, and the aircraft in those conditions is the absolute best tool in the bag. So we definitely need to, look at that with a scientific eye and say, well, we did see a reduction. Was it what we wanted? Could we get could we get every last mosquito out there? No, there's no chance for that at any time to be able to do that. And with that, Carter, can you step up and maybe take the rest of these quick for me? And if you excuse my absence, I'm going to step out and we're going to do a live TV thing. I think.
Yep, and I can take some of that. The voice part. I think that these folks that are emailing us and doing this and are doing a good job, and they're getting to our elected officials, they're getting to our leadership, and with that, that those are the things we hear, we see, and we start making changes, doing further investigations, and working with our stakeholders to try and find maybe different solutions, different patterns, and different ways of doing things. I can probably answer for Ben too that after the spraying that took place on August 26th, it was fairly overwhelming, and I don't think anybody had the intentions of shutting anything down. It was more of reacting, trying to figure out what happened, what was going on, and how things were going to progress. And so we did have a very high mosquito count still at that time. We were, on the edge of should we do another spray, which we all said nope. We got to figure out what happened with this last one and where it went. And so the answers weren't going to be heard within that day or 3 days or 2 weeks. We had 4 different organizations come in and do investigations and look into everything that was done, which everything was cleared and there was no findings found. So I think it's important that it's noticed that we continue to move forward and look to what happened, try and identify what happened and what we can do differently. So I think that covers a lot of that. Did I miss anything there? And we do have Jason Benson here, the Cass County engineer too, so that oversees the vector control program. Those are the 3 emails I received. Want to get up and introduce yourself?
Will do.
Let us know.
So first of all, my name is Bridget Riedel. I am a tax-paying citizen of Hunter, North Dakota, so I belong here in Cass County, unlike some folks in the courthouse who forget that we still exist. And yes, I'm going to take my mask off because I want you to see my face. Gentlemen, thank you for staying this evening for a little longer time. I'd like to end this on a very positive note. And I'd like to start out by introducing you to my family. And I have a reason for wanting very much to be supportive of vector control and the actions that Ben and others have taken. First of all, my compliments on the way things have been handled. I think that as someone in the rest of the county, we feel that vector control has done very well for us. In fact, for those of you who feel you don't want your yard sprayed, feel free to send it to mine. I'd be happy to. Why are the reasons for that? Well, let me begin. I want to take you back to the summer of 2012. Who can recall what that late summer weather might have been like? I can. It was dry all across the state of North Dakota. In fact, you would have thought that that meant a lower incidence of mosquitoes. But the truth was, the mosquito that does in fact carry the West Nile virus was highly prevalent. Because you see, in years where it is dry, that mosquito does tend to rear its ugly little head, more so in the later summer, late July into August. What happened in that summer? Well, first of all, once again, I'd like to introduce you to my family. And there's someone very vital who's missing from that, and that would be my dad. You see, he was out during wheat harvest that year, and he was bit by a mosquito while he was in the field. And Dad thought he just had the flu. And just like the rest of you, as a family, we believed that the West Nile virus was simply something where you were tired. Maybe you had some headaches, but you recovered. I'd like to give you an example of the very opposite. So you see, Dad thought that he had the flu, and he went to the hospital under that premise. He was also a diabetic. The hospital locally felt that they could treat him, but when that wasn't apparent within 36 hours, he was emergency transferred to Bismarck. That happened in August of 2012. He remained there until February of 2013, when he chose, after 6 months of a long myriad of illnesses, to turn off of his own life support, that my dad died. You see, the West Nile virus, like any other virus, is simply a portal to your body. And that mosquito opened the portal so that the following things happened: a heart attack, a stroke, the need for a pacemaker, the inability to swallow, the inability to breathe longer than 24 hours on his own, thus needing a respirator, which initially was a tracheotomy because he was indeed on life support. We also saw Dad not be able to walk, not to be able to hold his own head, the deterioration of the sheaths around his nerves, so he experienced what would be a neuropathy as those sheaths tried to heal. He was in a lot of pain, but more importantly, he couldn't walk, he was in a hospital bed, and he realized that he would be a lifetime feeding tube and respirator patient from 58 years old and on. He chose not to live that lifestyle, and so he's no longer here. What brought all of that? A mosquito. What could have saved that? Our continued use, like we do in Cass County and its surrounding areas, of vector control. I'm not saying that his local area let them down, but we heard the discussion that some communities don't have the budgets, the abilities, the resources. And so we are fortunate that we have those things here. And we need to make sure that we understand that West Nile, just like any other virus, affects the population. Understand that I can vaccinate horses, but I cannot vaccinate a human being. Even if I did, 5% of the population, the vaccine would not work for. The reason we don't vaccinate humans or have that type of technology, because we live in an incredibly litigious society. And the majority of those who could provide that solution are unable to. So we've put ourselves in that position. Again, I want to introduce my family. My dad is not here to enjoy his 4 kids, his 2 stepkids, and his 9 grandchildren. He was 58 years old. I firmly believe that what we do in Cass County with vector control needs to continue. Do I think we need the right, best management practices to do that? Yes, we do. Have many of the questions that have been raised tonight been about whether or not the product works that's applied, whether it's a larvicide or as an aerial application? The bottom line is they do work, and they save the majority of the human lives that it's targeted to. It was an unfortunate incident with the so-called Monarch massacre, and I'm sorry to see that. As an agriculturalist, I believe in the right in the environment as well. But I also believe that we as humans have the right, because we are taxpayers with the affability, to continue to spray for mosquitoes here in Cass County. And so I truly hope that we continue to go forward in the best practices and to continue to keep mosquitoes under control, because I don't want any more families to be missing someone in their pictures. So I appreciate your time tonight. Thank you for letting us go a little bit long. And for any other speakers, please do step up. Thank you.
We will welcome anybody else up to the podium, and we also have another meeting coming up that anybody is welcome to attend again. We're scheduled for March 3rd from 4:30 to 6, and this is something that it's educational, and it's getting the information out there, and we want to do more of this. So again, thank you for taking the time and spending it with us tonight, and we'll hang out here for a couple more minutes if you want any direct questions or anything from the side here. I know Ben will be back in here, or any of his team are here, or our pilot from Airborne Custom Spraying here is as well. So again, thank you so much for attending this evening.